Okay, welcome everybody. I wanted to remind you that it is Mardi Gras, and if you don't remember that, and one of our wonderful TAs, Carrie Sweet Harbison, writes the following to us. Mardi Gras signals a celebration prior to the traditional 40-day Lenten period of fasting, in which Roman Catholic Europeans would eat all the remaining luxury items that they had of meat, milk, and eggs and cheese in their houses. And because it was Lent, they'd be giving this up in the next few weeks. And what she notes for all of us to think about is that these items are distinctly different eating privilege than some of the items that we think about as privileged items today. She also goes on to remind us that the famous king cake, which we had some of in the dean's office today, was decorated with the Mardi Gras colors of gold, green, and purple that signify three different concepts: justice, money, and power. And she goes on to think about the ways in which the occasion of Mardi Gras could actually get us thinking about the relationship between justice and power. Is true justice, she asks, actually found in the absence of mighty power, or is the only place in which justice can be realistically enforced one of power? So very interesting questions, food literally for thought in the king cake of Mardi Gras. And we wanted to give you a little bit of orientation to today because many of you in your conversations have asked about more precise information about domestic food policies, including clarity about the U.S. Farm Bill, which came up last week, and domestic farm subsidies and how exactly they work. So Charlie Thompson, who is one of our teaching faculty and food experts, has agreed, because we want to be as responsive to your needs as possible, to do a 20-minute presentation on the subject today, followed by a short 10 to 15-minute Q&A. So just a reminder, we're going to be, after my intros, we're going to be doing 20 minutes with Charlie on the domestic farm bill and farm policy, 10 minutes of Q&A, 40 minutes with our guest speaker, who I'll be introducing right now, on international food aid, and a 15-minute Q&A on foreign policy issues in international food aid. So that's going to be our orientation for today, a little bit different than we thought, but very much in high response mode to your all's concerns. Before we go to that, and I do a little bit of orientation for us, I want to welcome our guest for today. This is her third class that she's teaching today, which is kind of amazing, and she's still standing. And she says that this is her favorite part of the day. I still couldn't quite discern why, but we're thrilled to have Phyllis Pomerantz here. She is a professor of practice at the Duke Center for International Development and the Sanford School of Public Policy. Many of you are from Sanford. She taught at Hartwick College and then moved on to a 26-year career at the World Bank, where she started in rural development and ended as a director. She worked in Latin America and in Africa on larger issues of rural development and international aid. And she teaches on and writes on international development, poverty reduction, aid, and government assistance. She's a real expert on all of these things. The question of food and international food aid and food security is not directly in her area of expertise, but she knows about it by virtue of writing on all these other topics. So she's really developed a whole new lecture based on her expertise for us today. So please join me in welcoming Phyllis Pomerantz. So thinking a little bit about framing for today, I'm going to be working with the thoughts of both Kathy and Charlie, as usual, in our conversations and reflections after last week's lecture. For 3 weeks now, we've heard about different versions of agrarianism, all of which were quite persuasive. A key moment for us as we thought about this was Sam Hummel, recent graduate, Duke graduate, talking about how wonderful his life was as a local farmer here in the Triangle, and that he got to eat good food and play music with five-star chefs. Purdy talked a little bit, a great deal actually, about agrarianism as a long really gift and legacy of American ideology, which had a kind of enchantment to it. Many of us, as we listened to that, became enchanted ourselves, and many of us resisted the implications of the American legacy of agrarianism. Last week, Gabe Rosenberg really broke that agrarian dream open. And reminder that his argument was that industrialization has happened. we're not going to return to farming en masse, local farming, and as well as farming for everyone. And the idea of local choice could, in fact, be elitist and very much gendered, as we saw from his presentation. And although Chantal Reed, as the respondent, still very much believed in the idea of the local, several parts of her response, especially when she talked about the carrying capacity of food production in the globe, belied the fact that local farmers could not feed 7 billion people. That's just a fact that we're trying to struggle with now. And just a reminder, Kathy observed that the conversation at the Dean's table was quite interesting. We really asked ourselves, could we really trust corporations to attend to externalities? And could Rosenberg's vision in response to one of our questions that politics could monitor this question of food really work when the U.S. government is so heavily funded by those corporations? We wanted to make sure that you think about what topics come up at each of your tables and how each of your many disciplines contribute to that conversation. And as we talk about globalization with Professor Pomerantz today, this is going to complicate things even further. And we wanted to outline several positions for you to think about. The first is the Lockever or agrarian position, and it argues in relationship to international questions that I'm going to use the term global south rather than the third world because I work in India and that's what they themselves would prefer to be called. People in the global south 30 years ago were happy and healthy with subsistence farming. People in Africa, South America, and Asia mostly lived in small villages, grew local food with local seeds, and lived lives based on time-honored practices. And around 1980, so the Lockever agrarian perspective goes, all that changed because corporations, transnational but mostly U.S. and European, realized that they were running out of land and cheap labor and basically forced farmers in the global south to enter the global economy. International banking organizations such as WTO, IMF, and the World Bank got involved in loaning money to small farmers to change what they grew from subsistence to high-priced cash crops for export, like coffee, chocolate, meat, wheat, soy, corn, potatoes, etc. We're going to hear a lot about corn in a couple of weeks. Governments and corporations controlled those international markets, say the critiques, and used farm subsidies drove the price of many commodities down so low that many small farms in the global south folded. We've heard about farmer suicides in India and can see the effects of this in Mexican and South American immigration. Many third world quote-unquote governments allowed corporations to set up offshore factories and farms and lowered the minimum wage in that country and decimated all worker benefits. Thus, the global south governments aided U.S. and European corporations in the takeover. The agrarian Lockever position implies that Western involvement considerably worsened the lives of farmers in the global south, and it argues that we should have left them alone, continuing in our first world, industrial world economy, and letting them continue with this subsistence economy. And therefore, it was a corporate ambition that was their downfall. And Vandana Shiva, who is a person that is a very activist writer from India, Deborah Brandt, whom we'll be reading, Raj Patel, whom we saw a couple weeks ago, all address this position and have various modes of this position. And it's worth noting here, and we've talked about this before, that the left and right don't really work well. Rosenberg last week made the case that agrarianism could actually be quite conservative. So the line between left and right get very slippery when it comes to food. The second position is that folks in the global south needed and wanted to improve their subsistence lifestyle. They argue that people in the developing world saw Westerners with their various goods and wanted the same of those goods, whether that was technology, clothing, you name it, food. Their governments lowered things like minimum wage and worker benefits only to bring industry and capital, as well as capitalism, to those developing countries, so the citizens of that country could obtain capital to buy the goods. The widespread use of the internet and communication technologies made it impossible for subsistence farmers in the global south to remain happy with their subsistence lives when they saw the lifestyles of the first world. Indeed, in the 80s and early 90s, this is what development meant, getting everyone into the international global economy. And this had the effect, so this position goes, of equalizing people so that we no longer have a first and a third world, a global north and a global south, but one global economy. From this position, there's no hidden motives by corporations, no greed at stake. Corporations wanted cheap land and labor, and local people in the global south simply wanted to supply that in order for those folks in those countries to reap the benefits of industrialization. And the left calls factories that make these things sweatshops. The defenders of globalization argue that people are working of their own free will. No one is forcing them to work. The left responds that their land has been seized by the people who forced them to default on loans. And this is all very, very complicated, and we're going to be dealing with this over the next 2 or 3 weeks. And this position does recognize that things did not work out so well in every part of the world, and thus the need for food aid, which we're going to be talking about some today, is important. And they say that we cannot allow people to starve and from the Western wealth perspective, and therefore must send food aid to starving countries. So you can see a number of different kinds of positionalities here. So here are the questions we need to think about. Are global food markets good or bad? Should industrialization spread across the globe? As it has, there's little debate about whether it will, but since it has, what is our responsibility to make sure that people in the global south have adequate income and lifestyle? This is not only a sweatshop question, but also a farm worker question, as migration is also a critical part of this picture of food production. Do we advocate for corporations to get out of developing countries, or do we advocate for fair trade and fair labor practices where the cost of goods will rise? Or do we ignore the problem and then offer aid? Right? So very interesting sorts of questions and conversations for everybody. And just to end by, before we turn to Charlie, by saying that Charlie Thompson also in this conversation reminded us that this really does involve a history of the global effects of colonialism and slavery, and a world diaspora that resulted from the 18th and 19th century world trade dominance by Europe and the extraction of the resources from the global south. So his point is very key, that long before 30 years ago, the world stage was already set and resources and people had already been extracted from their places. There were already clear winners and losers long before World War II solidified some of those geographical lines that we now consider fixed. So extremely important ways of framing our conversation today. And in the spirit of looking at some of those fixed lines and the history of those fixed lines, let's hear from Charlie about food and food policy.
Thank you, Laura. This is an impossible task, I'll say right up front, but I wanted to talk to you a little bit about how the U.S. has made food choices over the last 200 years. Kathy and I were just talking about this. Of course, my perspective is that we can't understand the present unless we know where we've come from. And thus, well, first of all, does everybody know what this machine is? Does anybody? Right, meaning combining various agricultural tasks in one machine. What crop are they harvesting? Okay. Well, we've had to continually live with this give and take in our nation's policy and political history. And it began right with the inception of this country, where we start right in the middle of the Enlightenment period, where John Locke first comes up with this phrase, life, liberty, and property. Thomas Jefferson picks up on that and says, life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, meaning that this nation should be made up of a lot of different people who are landowners and who therefore can promote democracy. We've heard that. The contradiction that we've lived with nationally, of course, comes from this agrarian view that we've heard: cultivators of the earth are the most valuable citizens. They are the most vigorous, the most independent, the most virtuous. They're tied to the country and wedded to its liberty and interests by the most lasting bands. In other words, small farming is the way that our policy should promote our democracy. The problem, the contradiction inherent in that, and this is Thomas Jefferson's garden at Monticello, some of you have seen, is that Thomas Jefferson owned slaves. He watched them work from the small garden house there. Quite a poignant scene. Right up above here, about here in this picture, are the slave quarters. Our nation's contradictions begin right away. Of course, we had the Civil War over this issue of slavery, and right after the Civil War in 1865 was passed the 13th Amendment that said we would no longer have slavery in this country. That is an agricultural policy, I just want to say, that we have decided that we need to have free people doing agricultural labor. That's a policy. The problem then is embedded in this punishment for a crime wherever the party shall have been duly convicted. There's a new movie, I just saw it last week on PBS, a documentary, also a new book out called Slavery by Another Name. It's a very interesting take on how the contradiction has continued in our culture with prisoners being used essentially as slaves in the South to harvest crops. All that's about policy. I'm just trying to give you some background. Also during the Civil War, 1862, the Homestead Act was passed with the political direction of having many people settle on the land in the Midwest. The contradiction in that, this was the 100-year anniversary in 1962, a stamp was issued. The contradiction in that is that mostly speculators, miners, foresters, and cattle ranchers obtained the land, not the small grower that Thomas Jefferson had dreamed of. Actually, out of the 500 million acres that were distributed, only 80 million, about 20%, went to small farmers. So we say that we are about small farmers politically, but we haven't lived by that. Also during 1862 is a major year. This relates to this story that we were circulating some around on our Sakai site, an act that's the first moral act. There were two of them. The first one in 1862, the same year that the Emancipation Proclamation was issued, that gave land for sale for the establishment of agricultural universities. Our policy established that this land could be sold by states, then in turn would make universities like NC State to do agricultural research. Our policy has made it possible for us to have research that's been publicly funded. That's the main point. Of course, some of that ag research has gone to benefit large entities, just like the speculators did with the Homestead Act. That's some contradiction. Is the ag research benefiting those whom we imagine as the family farm that we heard some about? Okay, also policy has made transportation a central part of how we help agriculture. In 1862, the first bill was passed. 1862 recurs. Finally, in 1869, the Transcontinental Railroad was built with federal money. And federal money then helped make billionaires. Well, eventually, there were millionaires like the Vanderbilts and other families that capitalized on this transportation. So we have a policy that's linking farmers to markets in the East that also benefits the great speculation that led to the Gilded Age. So skip then to the first, basically, the first bill that came about in the farm economy because we were in what, in 1933? The Great Depression. It begins the Agricultural Adjustment Act. That is a policy that basically makes it possible for farmers. I really think this is an interesting photo because of the positionality of, you know, you can see race and and power and so forth in this photograph. But these are farmers who are lined up waiting to get their checks from the government that, I'll just explain with this, that would undergird the prices that they were receiving at the farm gate. In other words, Henry Wallace, the Secretary of Agriculture under Roosevelt, who was very progressive, believed that government should get involved in agriculture, thought that these farmers were receiving low prices through no fault of their own. Therefore, the government should get involved in undergirding these prices using parity. What farmers have to pay should be balanced with what farmers receive. The interesting thing that he initiated is that he believed that the processors, the middlemen, the middle people, should pay the difference between what the prices farmers were paying and what they received. Guess how that went over with the early food speculators? They were up in arms in revolt against that. So his idea of parity paid for by the processors lasted about a year. So, also, our Agricultural Adjustment Act really controlled the supply of these 7 basic crops in the beginning: corn, wheat, cotton, rice, peanuts, tobacco, and milk. Those all still, with the exception of tobacco, which put this university on the map, are still part of the federal farm program. It started then. At that point, there was, as Henry Wallace mandated, there was a size limitation. But that also went by the way. But guess what happens when there's a set-aside program and farmers can opt to take some of their acreage out of production? What happened was that they took the acres out of production that where the sharecroppers, represented by Migrant Mother, probably the most famous Farm Security Administration photograph to come out of the 1930s, taken by Dorothea Lange. This is her camera in her car. She was driving along and she found the Migrant Mother with her children and made it famous. Interestingly, and what I want to emphasize historically, is that our government, through policy, established a Farm Security Administration through which we had documentarians, these photographers and writers going throughout the country to tell about, in photo and writing, the plight of our agricultural population. And that was part of our policy. She's paid by the government to do this. And thus we have this amazing collection in the Library of Congress telling the story of losses on farms. And so we're trying, with our policy, to help people. And meanwhile, some of our policies are putting people literally out on the road in search of another life in agriculture. Migrant Mother and others were headed to California to harvest crops in California. Also during this time, remember, right after the Civil War, during the Reconstruction period, Sherman marched through the South, and right after the war was over, promised that there would be 40 acres and a mule for many of the enslaved peoples who had been freed by, again, federal policy. It wasn't until the Roosevelt administration that we established a Rural Resettlement Administration. Here's one of the FSA photos showing this homeless person looking at a manufacturer's billboard about freedom and opportunity and the contradictions therein. Another Dorothea Lange photograph. But the establishment of the Farm Security Administration and the Resettlement Administration is what I wanted to draw your attention to, these priorities. Then we have a sense of there being a period of agricultural growth. World War II comes along and so forth. Agribusiness begins to take off. We have now a federal policy that is looked at with a lot of critique. And if you just Google Farm Bill, I don't know if you can read it, but I printed it up here. Of course there's pork. It's a Farm Bill. We've begun to associate this well-intentioned farm policy with this negativity of there being way too much given to the undeserving huge agribusiness and not enough to the small farmers, the Rural Resettlement Administration and so forth had emphasized. All right. What is the Farm Bill? The Farm Bill has grown to huge proportions. It's 500 pages, roughly, of regulations. It's drawn up every 5 to 7 years. Lately, it's been every 5. 2012, it's going to be passed again, voted on. It has a series of titles. There are really 15 of them, but I've just given you 10 here. Notice that the first Agricultural Adjustment Act has now expanded to, in this jump of decades that I've just done. Commodity payments for now 20 commodities. You can look all this up on a great website called by the National Ag Law Center. They summarize the Farm Bill. Of course, the Congressional Budget Office and so forth will give you many different summaries of the Farm Bill, and I don't need to tell you all the details of some of that. But just to say, at this point, that we are still supporting these various crop production, the various crops being produced, without size limitations now. And so some of the controversy and the hog on top of the Capitol building and so forth comes from the fact that we have not limited size in terms of what we support. Title II, conservation programs, soil conservation service and so forth. Title III, ag trade and aid, WTO regulated. We'll hear more about that from Professor Pomerantz. Nutrition food stamp programs. What I want you to know is we have a $145 billion U.S. Department of Agriculture outlays. 81% of that is mandated by law. 67 to, I've seen various figures, it depends on the year, 67 to 73% of all of that outlay is in the form of nutrition programs. You know, recently Newt Gingrich mentioned food stamps in his debate and called President Obama the food stamp president. And more people are on food stamps now than ever. Who wants to do away with that? You know, so when we look at this sort of mentality about the Farm Bill being huge and we need to get rid of it, it's all pork. Well, it does include other things. Farm credit. When I was a farmer in the 1980s, I sought a loan from this program called the Beginning and Limited Resource Farm Loan. It was a descendant of the Rural Resettlement Administration. It's called the Farmers Home Administration. There it is. It's still in the Farm Bill. Emergency credit, when people have experienced crop losses for one reason or another. Rural businesses are in the Farm Bill. Research, remember the Morrill Act in 1862. There was another second Morrill Act in 1890. We often refer to those as 1862 and 1890. But really it was the 1862 Morrill Act was for white universities. 1890 was for black universities. The HBCUs that did the research for African American communities, at least they divided it that way in the 19th century. There's still 2 ag schools in North Carolina, NC State and NCA&T in Greensboro, that are funded in part by this research from the Farm Bill. Forestry, bioenergy, and then look at the Title X. This is just including crop insurance, inspections, country of origin labeling, some of these kinds of protections that we have grown to depend on, and many people have criticized. And so I started telling you about the critiques and the push and pull and the controversies, because they continue. How many people do we support? What size farm do we support? What kind of energy? And so on. So now some of the, as of 1996 Farm Bill, all of the size controls were gone. It started going away in the 1930s, I told you, but by 60 years later, none of that exists. Now, this is probably one of the biggest controversies. The government that has spent billions of dollars that helps food processors. Remember back when Henry Wallace thought of that? Food processors get cheaper grain and other commodities, and then they in turn process that and are selling it back at a huge profit. There's no size limitations, again, so we can have what some people call an overabundance of agricultural production, in part subsidized by our dollars. I just put "that's us" to remind us that we pay for that. So controversies, to give you some of mine. The Farm Bill now artificially reduces the price that processors have to pay, as I just said, meaning that they can make a profit off of the difference. Processors have always wanted to buy cheap and sell high. That's capitalism, right? But our Farm Bill helps that, and that makes it controversial. So the lack of size limitations means that the big get bigger off the federal dime. Some farmers say we should just get everybody out and see how it all plays out, but we haven't played it that way. Our government has supported some over the others. So this has supported cheap livestock feeding, which makes their CAFOs more common. It creates problems in world markets as we see grain dumping, as we read in some of the readings. And then dumping, I know this from talking and interviewing a lot of corn farmers, not unlike this one, in Latin America, who can't make a living because of subsidized corn from the U.S. going into Mexico and other Latin American countries now, undercutting their price. Because remember, we help make up the difference. These are some questions and issues that I put in here that are things to think about. Do we emphasize the values of Jefferson? Do we want a large farm population of people supporting a democracy in the way he believed it? Of course, minus slavery. Are we content with having a farm bill that goes against some of the values of having many people on the land? We have had policies, and we still do. One of the elements of the 2012 Farm Bill will be a beginning farmer provision, and that's being debated now. How much money are we going to make available for people like Sam Hummel to buy land? That is the biggest issue in many ways. We have so many people interested in the Duke farm. How are those people then going to get credit to buy a farm? There has to be some sort of decision made at the policy level. So these are other values. Do we protect, is the Farm Bill, should we have it in place for protecting the environment for the future? Should we help the vulnerable through these food programs like food stamps and WIC, women, infant, children, and so forth, that the Farm Bill makes possible? Are we in agreement that as Professor Patton has told us, we have to make choices? Are we putting people on the land? Are we making food aid available internationally? This is a question domestically, too. So you can read the rest of those, and I'll send this also through Sakai, but I'll just go on a little. Here are some quotes that I found in relation to the debate that's going on in 2012. Senator Kent Conrad, North Dakota, chairman of the Senate Budget Committee. We have to expect that agriculture will contribute to deficit reduction. All of us are hearing that now. We have a growing federal deficit. Where in the ag bill do we cut? There's talk about cutting maybe $5 billion, but that's out of a $145 billion budget. We're not hearing about doing away with the USDA except for from some extreme corners. Here is our Secretary of Agriculture, Tom Vilsack. The department is prepared to do as much as we can with fewer resources. But there is no doubt that cuts will have a real impact on American agriculture and on American people. There will be pain, and everyone will have to sacrifice something. And so when we begin to think about food programs and children on food stamps, and as well as big farms, it gets more complicated. We have to make decisions about where our federal dollars go. And that's the kind of debate that we're having. I found these online. USDA has put these out. Look at how this pie chart lays it out. Nutrition assistance. If you put the farm commodity programs against what's happening with all the other conservation and so forth, it looks like a small amount. And so that, to me, relativizes this idea of the big pig on top of the Capitol building. You know, where is that? What part of that do we see as just pork, as earmarks, part of the federal waste that we hear so much about? Which of that is something that we can do away with? And so by the time you get to what expected, you know, they're shifting around, but we're still looking at 70-some% nutrition assistance. Commodity programs have now dropped to 13% from 15%. That's several billion dollars, but it's not doing away with it. There will be cuts, many people believe, and as we heard from Vilsack, there will be people who have to pay in one way or another. So I just wanted us to think about several thinkers, including Michael Pollan and some of those that we will actually read, have begun to ask, well, why are we divorced from this discussion of the Farm Bill? Perhaps because so few of us are farmers today. Unlike Jefferson's dream about the nation, we've become a nation of urban dwellers or suburban, and so few of us are directly engaged in agricultural production. Maybe we should call it the food bill. And then it begins to be about everybody. And then how do we begin to influence that kind of debate that's in a food bill if we think, oh, well, do we want school lunch programs? And if so, what kind of programs do we want? All of that's decided pretty much at the food policy level, although there are nutritionists in various schools who have some leeway in how they plan lunches and so forth. It starts with a federal outlay. And what we emphasize in terms of which commodities we undergird with our prices, our ag supports, and it is also our decision about how much we spend on conservation. Are we recently ethanol was part of the Farm Bill. Ethanol, you've seen it at the gas pump and so forth, and 10% of your gas is ethanol. We had decided, or at least some of our representatives had decided, that corn had been so plentiful in this country that we would begin to burn it in our gas, and that would be a good use of our dollars, that we would develop this. But what happened was it began to create price problems in other countries as well as this. And so now ethanol is no longer in the Farm Bill. Thank goodness, for as far as I see it. Should we be putting fuel in this? That's again, the the kinds of decisions that your elected officials make. We heard last week from Gabe about influencing your elected officials. We have a number of different people in North Carolina who are on the Ag Committee. We have a House Ag Committee. We also have a Senate Ag Committee. Those people are deciding through debate as we speak about which of the percentages will be spent of your tax dollars and what are our emphases. In the Farm Bill, too, there is a new set of regulations that even controls the word and the uses of the term and the practices called organic. Now, the federal government has gotten into that. Some people think to its detriment. Now we have an organic policy that allows big organic to define itself in a way that might go against some of your values. But it all begins here. And thus, and I was talking with some of the business school folks. They were wondering about how to affect policy. There are many different organizations. Center for Rural Affairs comes to mind. Also, the National Ag Law Center that I mentioned. There's the Carolina Farm Stewardship in this state, the Carolina Farm Stewardship Association, also Rural Advancement Foundation International. Many groups are working on trying to influence policy from their perspective. Small farm, organic, more people, limited resource people getting into agriculture. What about inner city kids? You know, back to our seeds discussion. Will they have a way to have access to credit if they want to be urban farmers? Those are the kinds of questions that we decide. Of course, we have ag schools in our state, as I've mentioned, but much of it begins at the federal level with the Farm Bill, and that will happen in this very year. Hopefully that gives you some background and some intro. Thank you. Oh, and will you help me pull it up? Okay. So the TAs and the faculty leaders of the class have been looking at this Hans Rosling's health specialist friendly take on statistics in a global sense. This will provide a little bit of an intro to your to the lecture that will follow. How do you fit all of this data? He happens to be with this, or was with the Data Institute. How do you fit a lot of data into a short period of time? I just gave you some data. I tend to privilege the photo. I'm less about statistics. But here we hear from Hans Rosling, who is a statistician and doing it in a friendly and active way, preceding our talk from Professor Pomerantz.
Visualization is right at the heart of my own work too. I teach global health. And I know having the data is not enough. I have to show it in ways people both enjoy and understand. Now, I'm going to try something I've never done before. Animating the data in real space, with a bit of technical assistance from the crew.
So, here we go. First, an axis for health. Life expectancy, from 25 years to 75 years. And down here, an axis for wealth, income per person, $400,000, $4,000, and $40,000. So down here is poor and sick, and up here is rich and healthy. Now, I'm going to show you the world 200 years ago, in 1810. Here come all the countries. Europe brown, Asia red, Middle East green, Africa south of Sahara blue, and the Americas yellow. And the size of the country bubbles show the size of the population. And in 1810, it was pretty crowded down there, wasn't it? All countries were sick and poor. Life expectancy were below 40 in all countries. And only UK and the Netherlands were slightly better off, but not much. And now, why start the world? The Industrial Revolution makes countries in Europe and elsewhere move away from the rest. But the colonized countries in Asia and Africa, they are stuck down there. And eventually, the Western countries get healthier and healthier. And now we slow down to show the impact of the First World War and the Spanish flu epidemic. What a catastrophe! And now I speed up through the 1920s and the 1930s. And in spite of the Great Depression, Western countries forge on towards greater wealth and health. Japan and some others try to follow, but most countries stay down here. Now, after the tragedies of the Second World War, we stop a bit to look at the world in 1948. 1948 was a great year. The war was over, Sweden topped the medal table at the Winter Olympics, and I was born. But the differences between the countries of the world was wider than ever. United States was in the front, Japan was catching up. Brazil was way behind, Iran was getting a little richer from oil, but still had short lives. And the Asian giants, China, India, Pakistan, Bangladesh and Indonesia, they were still poor and sick down here. But look what is about to happen. Here we go again. In my lifetime, former colonies gained independence, and then finally they started to get healthier and healthier and healthier. And in the 1970s, then countries in Asia and Latin America started to catch up with the Western countries. They became the emerging economies. Some in Africa follows. Some Africans were stuck in civil war and others hit by HIV. And now we can see the world today in the most up-to-date statistics. Most people today live in the middle, but there are huge differences at the same time between the best of countries and the worst of countries. And there are also huge inequalities within countries. These bubbles show country averages, but I can split them. Take China, I can split it into provinces. There goes Shanghai. It has the same wealth and health as Italy today. And there is the poor inland province Guizhou. It is like Pakistan. And if I split it further, the rural parts are like Ghana in Africa.
And yet, despite the enormous disparities today, we have seen 200 years of remarkable progress. That huge historical gap between the West and the rest is now closing. We have become an entirely new converging world. And I see a clear trend into the future. With aid, trade, green technology and peace, it's fully possible that everyone can make it to the healthy, wealthy corner.
Well, what you just seen in the last few minutes is a story of 200 countries shown over 200 years and beyond. It involved plotting of 120,000 numbers. Pretty neat, huh?
Okay, that was a good introduction to move a little bit beyond the local scene and even the national scene to the global scene. And I have to say that I'm going to talk about global food security, but I hope at certain points to bring it down to the local level. But you must know that when somebody like me thinks of the local level, they don't think of Durham. They think of the Sahel in West Africa or something of that sort. And I'm really about to talk about the people who are still down there at the bottom in Hans Rosling's presentation. So let's start this right away. I'm going to give a brief introduction, talk about what is food security, what limits it, and what can be done about it. And I hope to do that in a short period of time, maybe 25, 30 minutes. You know, you would think that the right to food and the right not to be hungry would be one of the basic human rights. And sadly, it isn't. There's over 1 billion people today in the world that live under $1.25 a day. Quite sadly, most of those live in rural areas and depend on agriculture for their living. And we don't expect that to get much better. By 2050, we expect the world's population, which right now is around 6 billion, to grow to 8 billion. So there's going to be 2 billion more. According to a recent article in the Financial Times, in order to feed all those people, we would have to increase agricultural production from today by 70%, which is an awful lot. 2050 actually isn't that far away. But even that doesn't ensure that everyone will have sufficient access to food. We know that agricultural production does not translate into nutritional outcomes at the household level. So it's a bit of a challenge, and it's a challenge on the supply side, but as I hope you'll see, it's a challenge even more on the demand side. So what is food security? I like to use the definition from the 1996 World Food Summit, which is a complicated definition, which says that food security exists when people at all times have physical and economic access to sufficient, safe, and nutritious food to meet their dietary needs and food preferences for a healthy and happy life. And there's really a lot of concepts involved in that. You know, there are basic concepts such as hunger, malnutrition, undernutrition involved in that. We can talk about it at different levels, at the global level, at the national level, at the community level, at the household level, and even at the individual level. And that definition also encompasses 3 different dimensions. The first dimension is availability. Is there enough physical food available for me to eat at all those various levels? So the physical availability of food. The second concept is access. Can you, even if there's food is available, can I access it? You know, here is where the concept of affordability comes in. And the way the food is delivered, where markets are disrupted. And the third concept is use. Is it the right kind of food? Does it provide, you know, the requisite calories, micronutrients, vitamins, minerals that I need to be healthy? Is the food acceptable given my religious preference and cultural values? No, that's not saying necessarily, this is not the argument of I don't want to eat broccoli. This is the argument of whether, you know, am I being forced to eat something that is against my beliefs? So what's the situation today at the global level? Well, there is a lot of hunger among those 1 billion people who live under $1.25 today. In addition to those 1 billion, Oxfam estimates that there's around 250 to 350 million people who are affected by natural disasters every year. Now, not all of those people go hungry, but a considerable number of them have food supply disrupted either temporarily or permanently. So rather a big deal. Now, the impacts of that are really well known. Malnutrition is not a passing phenomenon. It affects your intellectual development. It affects your physical development. You begin to have problems with learning. And there are really limited choices in life if you start your life with malnutrition. So big numbers here. One way we like to look at nutrition, at food at the global level, is to talk about a global hunger index. And the global hunger index is based on 3 indicators: the under 5 mortality rate, the prevalence of underweight in children, and the proportion of undernourished in the population as a whole. And it's calculated today for about 122 countries. And you can see the levels here. You know, these 59 countries are countries in trouble. And 4 countries have an extremely alarming level of hunger, which is the Democratic Republic of the Congo, Burundi, Eritrea, and Chad, all in Africa. You know, interestingly, when we hear a lot about hunger in this country, world hunger, it gets involved with politics. And so, you know, we hear a lot about For example, people in North Korea being very hungry. And, you know, North Korea has a hunger problem, but they're on the borderline between serious and alarming. There's at least at 25, 26 countries that have an even greater hunger problem than North Korea. Don't have to look at this whole slide, but, you know, as Hans said in the introductory video, progress has been fast. And you can see that in each of these regions, all of these are regions of the world, numbers are coming down. This is from 1990 to 2011. So in a relatively short period of time, we see declines in the global hunger index. But you should note how high it is still for South Asia and Sub-Saharan Africa. And you should know that it's not coming down, interestingly, as fast as the poverty level in a number of countries. And we know in a number of countries, and the two that I can cite are India and Egypt, where in fact the indices of malnutrition are higher than they should be for the level of income, the average level of income of the country. So it is not only a question of poverty, it's also a question of custom and uses of food. Now, let's take this down to the local level and what happens to many of those billion people. First of all, food comprises about 70 to 90% of a poor family's income. So even during normal times, poor families have trouble coping. But of course, farming is a very risky business. And again, most of these billion people are rural people involved in agriculture. Farming is an extremely risky business, especially in poor countries, and you're a poor small farmer. So when you have food price hikes, or when you have problems with productions, droughts, floods, etc., or declining trends of rainfall, for example, because of global warming, at the household level, families start changing the way they live. At the livelihoods level, they reduce non-food expenditures. They begin to sell off non-productive assets. Non-productive assets are things like any furniture they have. As things get worse, children drop out of school. The family may migrate. More child and women labor is used. And they begin to borrow money for subsistence. Then, as things get worse, they sell out all productive assets and then virtually everything they own. Then they start cutting down on essential items like food. And as a last resort, they may even resort to illegal or unhealthful activities. And you get a lot of human trafficking that comes out of this kind of situation, for example. In terms of food security, as things get worse, families first change to cheaper, lower quality, and less preferred foods. They'll reduce the diversity of consumption. So I've seen many families that will eat, for example, corn morning, noon, and night. And they'll favor certain family members over others. Mothers may give more to a young child and not give enough for herself, even though she herself is still breastfeeding, for example. So immediately the younger child is in food difficulty. They may give more to the working members of the family. Men may demand more and take more of the food in several countries. As things get even worse, they reduce the number and size of meals. Not unusual to have one meal a day. They'll consume more wild food, seeds. As things get even worse, they beg for food, they send children to neighbors to see if they can eat. People go whole days without eating, and finally they eat things like plants and insects that they've never eaten before. And obviously the end result is child malnutrition, and in some extreme cases, death. This is not an unusual or a crisis scenario. This is not a famine scenario. During the hungry season from 1 to 3 months, in poor countries, there are many poor rural families over and over again, particularly in Africa and Southeast Asia, that experience some form of what I've just described. So it's quite severe. So I think we have to ask ourselves, what is limiting their availability, the availability of food to them, their access, and their use of food. First thing is natural disasters really do have an impact on agricultural production. So that is one of the first things, but that is not the worst thing. Probably the worst thing is conflict. Where there is conflict, there is hunger and difficulties with food. Next thing that limits the availability of food is trade policies. If countries, for example, in the 2008 food price spike, Russia banned the export of wheat. So countries that were used to exporting their wheat from Russia all of a sudden did not have wheat available in the marketplace at any price. Some countries have import bans because they're trying to protect their own agriculture, but then when something goes wrong, they have the problem that they still have an import ban. Subsidies that discourage farm production coming from places like rural areas in Africa. And we've heard cases today about what the Farm Bill does and continuing subsidies in U.S. agriculture. The subsidies, perhaps, of the European Union are even more harmful to poor small farmers in other parts of the world. Poor infrastructure, poor roads, poor storage. It limits not only small farmers' ability to produce, it limits the possibility of getting available food into certain areas. Some countries go into such economic crisis that they don't have the foreign exchange necessary to allow anyone to import food. So we've seen crises where countries don't have sufficient food supply and they don't have enough foreign reserves in their treasury to be able to buy food in the marketplace. Production, insufficient agricultural research. We have something called the 90-10 rule in agricultural research, which means that 90% of the dollars for international agricultural research are spent on 10% of the farmers, the richest farmers. Most research is very crop specific. That is not what small farmers do all over the world. Small farmers are risk adverse, so they like to intermingle, have variety of crops, crops for subsistence, some crops to sell in the market. Now, the situation may be getting better, but that's certainly one of the issues here. So that's part of why food is not available. Other issues, which I'm sure you've talked a little bit about in this class, limited land for expansion. In some places, there is nowhere to go. There are no new lands to expand for agricultural production. We also have a lot of agricultural land in non-efficient land uses. Biofuels, where it isn't justified, that was certainly the case of the corn subsidies in this country for ethanol. And meat production, it's much more efficient to grow grains than it is to grow cows, actually. And food with low nutritional value, because it's not only the amount of food, it is what is in the food. Food waste, I'm sure you have talked about that here. Enormous amount of food waste in the United States and Western Europe in particular. And then you get these temporary phenomena of panic hoarding. In 2008, when there was a really steep food price hike, there was a run on rice at Costco and Sam's Club. That's the kind of panic hoarding that goes on all over the world when they see that food prices may be coming up. Now, what that panic hoarding does is limit the availability of food available. Now we look at access. Sometimes it doesn't matter how much money you have. You can't buy any food. There is just simply no food available in the marketplace. There is no market. That's certainly the case when you have disasters, and it's certainly the case when you have war and conflict. And that really limits food security. Obviously, a big limit is a lack of income. You just don't have the money to buy food. And it's kind of The self-sufficient farmer, which we may have liked, has virtually disappeared. All rural families need some money. They need money for kerosene, they need money for oil, they need money for matches. I mean, they're basic, there is virtually, even in the most remote places in Africa today, people do need to buy some part of their household food. Very few families today are virtually self-sufficient. Inadequate safety nets, which means that where there is no market, where there's disruption, in this country we have safety nets. We have emergency support. We have food stamps. That is not the case in most countries in the global south. Another reason for lack of access is, again, this intra-family or communal rationing. You know, we have the little food we have, we'll save for the men who are working. And finally, sudden price increases. In both 2008 and 2010, we saw some of the highest historical prices in the world. And that really translated into huge issues for a number of countries, and there were riots in something like 47 countries because of it. So let's just quickly look at the prospects for future prices. And we don't have to go through all of this, but you can see there's a lot of arrows that are red and pointing up, which means that there are a lot of prospects for food prices going up. The more food prices go up, the more limited access to food there is. Now there's some good prospects too. One is that we can have productivity increases and production increases that might bring prices down. Different subsidy policies and different trading policies might bring prices down. But there's certainly a lot of forces bringing those up. And chief among those are the growth of the population, rapid urbanization so that there are more mouths to feed who don't grow their own food, and the growing middle class, particularly in very large countries like China and India, who are demanding more food and better food and more expensive food. Third aspect of food security is use. And here, you know, my cultural religious beliefs so there may be food available, but it's not food that I can eat or that I wish to eat. But more important than that is really the situation of other issues that don't allow you to use food efficiently. Unclear water and poor sanitation. If that is your life, which is the life for most of those billion poor people, the food you eat is not efficiently used. Sickness is a huge problem among the poor. Lack of nutritional knowledge. There's been lots of work done in India about the fact that mothers do not know what to feed their children. There can be things that are available at the same cost or lower cost. There's been a lot of studies done in this country that say the same. So that's another thing that gets in the way in the use. And then finally, there's a thing that's quite controversial, which was really the point of the Banerjee and Duflo article, which is that, the poor, if they have extra money, they may not be using it for food. They may have preferences to use it for other things. In one area of India where they worked, they estimated that, in fact, if poor families stop spending money, and these are extremely poor families living under $1.25 a day, that if they stopped spending money on alcohol, tobacco, and festivals, that they would, in fact, have 30% more food, 30% more income to eat food. And they concluded the article with this old man who's supposedly in a nutrition, not so old man, but middle-aged man, I guess, who's in a nutrition trap because he hasn't had enough to eat, so he's too weak to work, so he's too weak to work, so he doesn't have the money to buy food, and that looks like a nutrition trap until they're leaving the house and they notice a TV. And they go, what about the TV? And he goes, but some things are more important than food. You know, and I think we do have to recognize the fact of the matter is that we don't always eat what's good for us. And when we have an extra bit of money, it's not necessarily that we take, you know, the most healthy options either. So those are all things that are involved. So the question is, what can you do about it? Or what are people doing about these things? And, you know, I'm a development practitioner, even before I'm an academic. And so I can't just leave it with the diagnosis, because there's certainly lots of things that can be done. The first thing is we have to deal with short-term and emergency situations where there is a market disruption. Those are always going to exist. Those are the very limited situations where I see some room for physical food aid. The kind of aid that is given by the United States and delivered by the World Food Program. This is far from an ideal solution and needs to be used very carefully. Again, in areas where you expect periodic disruptions of the market. It's a bad solution, but it's the only one we have right now. To reduce some of the uncertainty, the World Food Program is actually moving to have some regional storage units, which they're going to be putting close to usual hunger spots in the world, exactly where disasters are prone to happen. We're starting to see some regularity now with global warming, where the recurring droughts are happening, where the recurring floods are happening. And when they do that, that is also going to allow the World Food Program to do more sourcing of food locally and regionally, which will be good for the same rural poor families. So we do need to do that. Second thing, if we are not going to have children going hungry, there's been a lot of sexy different programs, but in fact school lunches, and I think some of us remember subsidized school lunches in this country, well, school lunches turn out to be a very effective tool to combat malnutrition, particularly effective when the food is locally sourced, cooked by local people, and really effective when the children are also allowed to take some of the food home to their families. In most situations, though, there are markets for food. And so the poor countries and poor people in poor countries need some of the safety net schemes we have, like cash or food vouchers. I mean, that's what a food stamp is. It's basically a food voucher. Those programs have very limited availability, but the World Food Program is moving towards those instead of physical distribution of food. We also have very promising schemes, conditional cash transfers, that are used to combat poverty, and the idea is families get a monthly stipend conditioned by having their children regularly attend school or having regular health clinic checks for their children. These programs are turning out, we thought they were going to help sort of long-term with health and education and sort of the longer-term human development. They turn out to have a really good effect on poverty. And with that, increased food. So those are very promising. But as I say, in all of these, we need to look at local sourcing and staffing. We need more focus on the vulnerable. Women, children, old people. No, you know, old people and very young kids are exactly the people who are, who are not met by, for example, a school lunch program. So that's what can be done sort of in terms of the chronic situation, the safety nets. But safety nets are a very small part of this picture. What we really need to do is increase attention to small farm families. I have to say that I do not have a romantic view of small farming. My view of small farming is that it's a horrible, dirty, risky, awful business that most people would like to not have to do, because that is my vision of the Global South. But if I am going to do it, you need to increase productivity and production, particularly among small farmers. That means you need research and agricultural extension geared to those farmers, geared to the kind of mixed cropping systems they have, geared to the way they use their whole farms. you need more farm-to-market infrastructure for them. Small-scale irrigation, roads, on and off farm storage. Small farmers need more risk insurance. They need to have some risk insurance. You know, here, again, in this country, even small farmers have some safety nets. They're in free fall in most other parts of the world. The other thing that can be done with small rural families is they really do need more nutritional information. I have to say that Brazil has been at the forefront of this, providing women extension workers who work with women on nutritional education, on family gardens and things like that to help improve malnutrition in the poorest parts of the country. So all of that is very important. Fortunately, we've seen some renewed interest in this. One of the things that happened is, I don't exactly know why it happened, because I started my life as an agriculture and rural development specialist, but for the last 20 years, agricultural development in the Global South has been neglected. It doesn't seem so from the big controversies and stuff, but in fact, for small farmers, it's been neglected. Perhaps because of the 2008 and 2010 price hikes, things have changed, and things are changing. And thanks to increased investment through aid and also through the Gates Foundation. The Gates Foundation has gotten very involved in this question of increasing agricultural development. And finally, I think we need to consider big policy changes. And I'm not getting into transgenic crops here. I don't want to get into that. And food fortification. But you know, if you can build a better crop that can withstand a bigger drought, that might be good. I just want to leave that thought with you. You know, not everything is about making your food unnatural, but there are some things. Biofortification. We know that when they put groups of specialists together in the world, the things that they come up with that are the cheapest and best things are to start providing more micronutrients to poor families, for example. We need, you know, to look very carefully at any subsidies and mandates for biofuels. There are places where biofuels are economic and should be grown, and there are places where it can't be. Clearly, this is now a world where it is, you know, it's not going to go back in the other direction. It's going to stay globalized. So these global local food chains are there, and small farmers need to have information and need to be able to choose. And we have some very interesting studies going on. For example, even for Eastern and Western Europe, you know, do tomato farmers in Hungary, is it better for them to participate in these international global food chains, or is it better for them to grow for the local market? So far, the preliminary evidence is that it's better for them to grow for the local market. That's an ongoing PhD study, actually, here at the Sanford School. So we'll see. I mean, you know, and that may be just an aberration. Trade policies, helping food and helping small farmers from those countries have the ability to export their food to other countries. And I heard what Charlie said about you know, it is a small percentage of the Farm Bill U.S. subsidies, but they're still there, and they're not geared to income levels or size of farming. Some of those subsidies knock out the possibility for small farmers in other parts of the world to export and produce. So those are some of those things. Obviously, global warming is a big unknown in this picture. It's getting, unfortunately, more and more known. We need decisive action on global warming and its containment. We also need to help these countries adapt because those the bottom billion are exactly the ones most affected by global warming. And finally, we need more income-generating activities. So that really comes pretty much to the end of what I wanted to say. This is a great quote from Josette Sheeran, who just left her post as head of the World Food Program, and it says, solving the hunger food security issue is not only a compassionate issue or an equity issue, it has implications for world peace and security. And, what she said is, without food, people do one of three things: revolt, migrate, or starve. At the same time, I think, and let me say this finally, I think we have to be really careful about projecting our preferences onto others. As the cliche goes, man does not live by bread alone. The real challenge, in my view, in this food crisis is really to fight poverty, because it's poverty that forces people to choose between their heads, their hearts, and their stomachs. So. And we can post this on Sakai. So you
Wonderful. Thank you, Phyllis. So how it works now is that we're going to get you and Charlie to stand there, and we'll have time for maybe 10 minutes of questions, 15 minutes of questions, and I will field them because I have to repeat the question for the tape. So that's sort of, and Dean Patton had to leave. So
and we have a mic.
And you have mics.
Right.
Because Dean Patton had to go to a diversity banquet, and she
Yes.
sends her regrets and forgot to tell you, she says, but would be here if she could. Thank you.
So, questions in the back. And as Dean Patton likes to know, where are you from? You're a what? Undergrad? Great. And your name? Great. I think I need you to either stand up or speak louder or both. I can barely hear you, and I have to repeat the question.
I think both, yeah.
Okay, I'm an evolutionary anthropology major, and I'm just wondering, so a big problem that I think hasn't been addressed that directly relates to hunger is overpopulation and the population explosion, especially in the developing world, and I'm wondering if you think that a lot of these aid programs should focus more on family planning, education, and maybe less on providing food.
And I have to repeat the question. So, the question from Gretchen in evolutionary anthropology, is it not Gretchen? Reshna, sorry, I can't hear you. Is the overpopulation question, should food aid agencies be more focused on family planning? And you have a mic. You don't.
Oh, right. I have a mic, so I don't have to go there, which is great. That's a great question. And, in fact, it's a question that's been mulled over and over and over in the international aid scene. And, in fact, in the 60s and 70s, there was a lot of emphasis on trying to limit population, particularly in light of the growing agricultural needs and food needs and stuff. And what we've pretty much sorted out by now is that population control is not an independent variable. It's a dependent variable, which means as incomes improve, people start having fewer children. So we're seeing already in lots of countries, population rates of growth go down. So most people and most aid agencies now do not support population control. There's been a lot of politics around there. There's been a lot of accusations that the global north is trying to control or limit the global south. That, Christian aid organizations are trying to limit non-Christian population. There are a lot of, ethical considerations and political considerations with that. Now, so globally, we aren't doing much on population control per se. Now, information, there is a lot going out. but it is very controversial. It's even controversial for the donors. The U.S. Policy on this, in terms of its aid programs, bounces up and down depending on whether it's a Republican or a Democratic administration. And so the USAID has either put on or off its population activities every 4 years, basically, or every 8 years. And they're very sudden shifts. So they're not doing that. I just want to add one footnote, which is China. China has had a one-child policy for quite a long time. It has undoubtedly contributed to its rapid economic growth. But that is a forced policy, and it's one that they're beginning to abandon because there's a lot of protest against it.
Could I just add, or actually ask you a question? Why it seems almost counterintuitive that someone who is hungry or financially insecure would have larger numbers of children. Why is that?
Families are very large. Why? Because why would a rural poor family have a lot of children? They need more people to work, so they need more hands. Child mortality rates are much higher, so if you want to wind up with 5 children, you probably have to have like 15 in some countries. And if there's no Social Security, old age pensions, whatever, who are you going to rely on when you're an old person? I have to say that, not to bring it to a personal level, but I don't have any children. And, as you start facing sort of getting middle age, you start thinking, yeah, boy, I really wish I had a child. So you can really understand the forces that lead to having very big families in low-income countries.
Next question, right here. Name and location.
My name is Christine. I'm a Master of Divinity student. And I have 2 questions. It sounds like a lot of what Josette Sheeran offered, you also offered in your talk. And I did struggle a little bit with some of the issues she was raising. So I have 2 questions. One is, how can we approach these aid programs while keeping our ethnocentric tendencies, colonialist tendencies in check? For example, can the school meal program, which is dependent on corporations like Kraft and Yum Brands, really address the issues you brought up of climate and conflict control and consciousness?
Hold on.
No.
So I only kind of think I see one, but let me see if I can pull the second one out. The first, so Kristen from MDiv program wants to know how we can approach food aid while keeping our ethnocentric and colonizing tendencies under control. And the second part of that is, can school lunches really do it when school lunches are being sort of funded and servicing corporations? Is that right? Great.
Also, great questions. First of all, you have to distinguish food aid and other kinds of aid, although they're all aid. Food aid is a particularly difficult form of aid. It's not one recommended. Maybe I should bring this out more clearly, but it's really only in emergency situations that there should be food aid. There is still too much food aid in the world. But other kinds of aid suffer from many of the same problems. The aid industry is a very problematic industry. And how do you get that better? In my view, you get it better by getting more control from the recipient. Now, that involves a lot of complicated elements, but there is some leverage that recipients have over donors. We're talking about country-to-country aid, and I teach whole courses about it, so I can't get into that, but it is a problem. Most people give aid. When you go through the motivations of countries providing official aid, I do this on a blackboard in my course on the politics of aid, a few weeks earlier, we do the motivations for colonialism, and guess what? They're the same.
That's great.
So, we're not going to get over that, but the question is countries and people do need aid in certain circumstances. So how can you get better control over it? And that's by more recipient control over it. So that's the first thing. On the school lunch program, these school programs that are happening in low-income countries, in very low-income villages, are not dependent on large international corporations. Those they are sourcing, local corn or U.S. corn, but they are not using any industrialized products at all. At all. I mean, they are the most simple of simple kinds of meals.
Could I also ask another question related to that? Will globalization provide these local communities more information? I mean, is there hope in that side of globalization that the people who are affected by food aid and so forth can have more information at hand to be more controlling about what they receive and so on?
The control of all of this starts at the people at the end of the line have the least control. It is going to take a long time for the people at the end of the line to have control. They don't have control over their lives. When you are 70 to 90% dependent, when food takes that much of your budget, and food is scarce for you because you earn so little, or produce so little, think of that. A farmer who is producing on a quarter of a hectare of land, a hectare is less than an acre, a little bit more than half an acre, that is not enough to feed a family. And so they really are in a situation out of control. I think it's going to be a long time before actually the most stubborn poverty problems get addressed.
So information is not the same as power?
No.
We have time for one more. Yes.
You mentioned that.
Where are you from?
Oh, I'm sorry. My name is Taylor from the Pratt School of Engineering.
Okay.
You mentioned that by 2050 we'll need 70% more food production. Would you say that the solution is in reducing that number and making better utilization of the food we have now? Or is it more worthwhile to just increase production as much as possible?
So the question from Taylor and Pratt is the statistic that by 2050 we are going to need 70% more food than we have now. And Taylor wants to know, is it possible that that can come from better utilization, or do we just need to actually increase production that much? Is that fair?
Yeah, and another good question, and I wish I had some data backing what I'm going to say, but I don't have any at hand. I think the production needs are higher than what is currently being wasted. I mean, it reminds me of, being a small child and my mother saying, eat up, there are people starving in Europe. I mean, now we say there are people starving in Africa, but, the fact of the matter is there's a really long distance for food to travel, and where food is being wasted is not necessarily where most of the food is being needed. That's not to say that on a national level, and even on a local or regional level, we shouldn't be doing more, because of course there's many poor families in North Carolina, and look at the kinds of food we waste. I mean, it's horrible. But that is not going to solve the problem of where most of the additional need is going. It really has to be by increased production. There's two aspects to production. One is you put more acres under production, so you grow more food, and the other is that you simply do it more intensely. So for every acre you plant, you get better, more nutritious food out of it. Converting, where we can convert pasture land to cropland, that's a good deal. The problem is that there's also agronomic conditions. So not every place where you can put a cow, you can grow crops on. So there are a lot of constraints and a lot of difficulties. I have to say that I don't think that the biggest challenge, even though it's a big number, is increased production. I think it's increasing people's access, having people being able to afford food.
Great. So we're out of time because the food upstairs is ready. We're actually 5 minutes over. Professor Pomerantz, though, is going to be in Jim's group, right, on the left-hand side of the room. So if you guys have questions in your group and you want to come fetch her for 15 minutes and move her over to your place, I think she would probably be amenable to that. And we can mill around down there while we're getting our food, and she can answer questions then, too. Thanks to both of you.